Hello everyone, welcome to this video where we're going to be doing the artillery munition face-off round 2, Russia versus Ukraine. Which country has what advantage in terms of artillery munitions on the battlefield? What are the battlefield ratios? We've always heard Russia has a big advantage. How big is that advantage? We made a video on this several weeks ago. We're revisiting that topic for reasons which I will discuss shortly. But first of all, taking a step back, what is the methodology for counting what the artillery uses on the battlefield? Any pre-war stocks are considered burnt in the first year. So what that means is that all the pre-war stocks that Ukraine had, that Russia had, or for example that the EU had, these are considered to be used within 2022. Second of all, the production of Russia, Ukraine, and European states will be also considered burnt in year, right? So any artillery ammunition that is being produced by Russia in 2024, for example, will be entirely used within that same year. Third, donations from non-EU slash European countries like North Korea, South Korea, the US, Canada, Australia will be considered burned in the year of donation. So for these countries, I'm not looking at the production, the total production. I'm just looking at what was officially donated through official channels, right? And this should give us the amount of ammunition that Ukraine and Russia have at their disposal within each year. Or that is my attempt at approximating that number, right? And so what are the changes versus the previous video, the previous study? These are, by the way, changes that were 100% submitted by you guys when I uploaded my last video. Many of you had really valid comments and concerns about certain topics that I was not aware of. And so what are these changes? First of all, there have been some double counting errors. For example, some Rheinmetall production was counted as Germany, whereas it was also produced in other states, right? And we don't want to be double counting here, or donations that were double counted. Second of all, we are going to be adding non-EU donor countries such as the US and South Korea. We're going to be including the Czech artillery initiative. We're going to be adding certain countries which were not included last time, such as Bulgaria, the Baltics, etc. You're going to see it in the data later. And then we also rechecked and edited each and every single country's data, right? And again, this is all thanks to your feedback and your comments on my last video in order to every time get closer to what could be the truth, right? And I'm a one-man show, so I really appreciate your support and your ideas on how I can get to that truth, how we can get to the truth together. Right, so let's jump right into it. Let's look at what Ukraine has, as said previously, in terms of stocks for Ukraine and the EU in the first year, then in terms of production from Ukraine and the EU for every single year, and then in terms of donations from other countries like the US, South Korea, Canada, and Australia. And when we look at this, in the top left, you see all of the countries that I took a look at. In blue, you have European countries and European stocks. And European initiatives like the Czech initiative, which is European budget used to buy artillery shells, likely from South Korea or some other third party, but likely South Korea, but using EU money. Then we have the largest player in the room is the US, which is in green. We have South Korea, which is one of those countries that punches way above its weight in terms of artillery shells, and we'll see that that's the same for North Korea. Then we see Canada and Australia. They're actually not significant players, but I included them just to have them included based on the feedback from the last video. And then we have Ukraine, which also punches above its weight, but is also not a massive player, right? And so high level, what do we see? We see prior to 2022, European and Ukrainian production at 200,000 per year, right? And when the war starts, that's when the European stocks and the Ukrainian stocks get burnt, according to my methodology. And we also start seeing the European production and the US donations, South Korean donations, etc. So that goes up by 510% to 1.4 million approximately in 2023. That increases slightly to 22%. In 24, it increases significantly to 57%, all the way to 2.6 million. And in 2025, that increases again even more significantly to 68%. By 68% to 4.4 million. So a huge increase. And high level, we can say that the main players here are the US is a main player. Almost every single year, at least 2023 and 2024, it was the major block donor. Then the second major player is the EU, which in 2022 and 2025 again are the major donors. And South Korea punching way above its weight, and Ukraine, right? What are the players that are most interesting to look at? Obviously, US, as I said, South Korea. That's why I made them into a separate color. Ukraine is a big player, but what else is significant? The Czech initiative is a huge initiative. We can see in 2025 that alone was a donation of approximately 50% of total US donations. We see that the UK by 2025 is a major player at 320,000, and Spain is a major player at 450,000, right? Those are the ones I marked in a slightly different shade of blue. And Spain and the UK, for example, Spain is due to a huge expansion of Rheinmetall production, and the UK also increased significantly its production, right? So what we see is a growth from in 2022 1.4 million to by 2025 4.4 million. That is a huge growth. And we can also say that the growth was initially fueled by US donations, but that by 24 and 25, that growth is coming significantly from the European initiatives, right? So the growth is switching from the US over to Europe, and that sort of makes sense if we know that, if as far as I'm aware, the US donations are still Biden administration budgets, which have been locked in and are not going to be extended, as far as I'm aware. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that, right? And so what we might expect is in 2026, those US donations to really fall off a cliff. And then the EU will have quite a hard time to fill that gap of 1.5 million approximately 1.5 million artillery shells in terms of donations, right? And so maybe 26 and 27 will be actually a reduction of artillery shells despite European production growth. On the Russian side, we are looking at the Russian stocks, and they had much larger stocks than Europe and Ukraine before the war. We're looking at Russian production, and we're looking at North Korean donations. So North Korea is acting a bit like the US and South Korea as a donor, and Russia in this methodology is acting like Ukraine/Europe, that its stocks and its production immediately flow onto the battlefield. And so high level, if we remember the number previously from 2025 for Ukraine, that was 4.4 million. We see that in 2022, Russia already had 4.5 million artillery shells. By 2023, that went up to 6 million, 2024 to 9 million, and 2025, 10 million. And so what are things that really surprise me here is the scale of North Korean donations. I mean, I wrote here, North Korea is scarcely strong in artillery shell production and therefore donations. They basically invested all their skill points into artillery shell production. I think this is a strength right now, but might end up being a long-term weakness as we look at the war evolving, right? The importance of drones and FPV drones in particular is becoming more and more important. If North Korea has all its skill points invested in artillery shells, how will that impact a potential future war where artillery shells may not be that relevant anymore? But high level, these numbers are enormous in terms of scale. And one report that I read is that this is possible because Soviet 152 millimeter costs approximately 25% of in terms of versus NATO 155 millimeter in terms of production, right? So in terms of 155 NATO, this would be 1/4. So 2025, the 10 million could be considered 2.5 million in terms of NATO 155 millimeter. That doesn't mean that the shells are inferior. Many of your comments in the previous video were, hey artists, thank you, great video, but North Korean artillery shells and Russian artillery shells are way worse than NATO standards. That may be the case. That is likely the case. But that's just very hard to quantify. What multiplier or what reliable study of artillery shell fail rate can I use to apply on this 10 million to, for example, say, actually these 10 million should be multiplied by 50% because 50% of the shells don't work or don't land where they're supposed to. I think that's a bit difficult to do, and I think it's best to not underestimate rather than let's just take the numbers that we have and take the worst case scenario. Right? Let's take the worst case scenario for us. Let's assume that these 10 million shells are actually properly made shells that are equivalent to a NATO 155 millimeter. I think it wouldn't be safe to underestimate, let's say, the Russian artillery stocks in this sense. But looking at this, that scale is enormous, right? It goes from 4.5 million all the way to 10 million. By 2025, that's way more than what Ukraine has available. And what is also extremely impressive is simply half of it is North Korean ammunition, right? So Russia is actually insanely dependent on North Korean artillery shell donations. With as of 2023, half of all the shells coming from North Korea, essentially. And so that is a very interesting finding for me. And also we can see that the growth is not as big. So where we saw significant growth into 2025 and into 2024 for Ukraine, the growth here has really hit a sort of glass ceiling, right? As they cannot further activate factories which are already fully activated. They're working already 24/7, producing artillery shells as much as they can, maybe at the cost of quality. So we see that easy growth is already squeezed out of the way. And so why did we look at all that data? It's to come to a battlefield ratio comparison. We've always read Russia has a X to 1 artillery advantage in Ukraine. Well, it has an artillery advantage in Ukraine, and let's take a look at how that's evolved over the years, assuming the previous slides are high-level accurate. In 2022, for each Ukrainian shell, there were 3.3 Russian shells. In 2023, that worsened. There were 3.6 Russian shells for every Ukrainian shell. In 2024 is the first year where that Russian advantage started to reduce to 3.4. So still an insane overmatch, actually. And 2025 is the first year where that number really significantly reduces from all the way down to 2.3. So you can say high level, the Russian advantage went from 3 to 4, all the way down now to almost 2 to 1, right? And I think that's a huge change and one that's trending positively for Ukraine, right? We saw that the European production was actually starting to increase quite significantly. And so this is a positive evolution, a positive trend, but it is still definitely a very bad ratio for Ukraine, right? It's a bad ratio to have 2.3 Russian artillery shells for every one that you have, right? That means that the Russians can bomb everything 2.3 times more than you can. And so that's something that is still a weakness on the Ukrainian side and a strength on the Russian side. And that's something that needs to be worked on. So what does that mean for the future? Here on the graph, I simply extended the last graph by 2 years, 2026 and 2027. What are the assumptions? Essentially, I used news reports regarding new artillery factories opening up across Europe and the expected artillery shells that would be produced in each of these factories. And B, the other major assumption is that the US does not extend its aid to Ukraine in 2026 and 2027. As far as I'm aware, it is a Biden era budget that is still running out, and there is no significant plan to extend that, right? So we're seeing a massive reduction of US donations and an increase in European donations. And we see that in 2026, that results in a reduction of Ukrainian artillery shells, whereas Russia keeps going up. And in 2027, that reduction increases back to 5 million, right? And so if we remember, the US was donating 1.5 million shells in 2025. Assuming that goes to 0 in 2026, thankfully, Europe is able to cushion that loss to a significant degree, and by 2027 even surpass it. But when we look at the ratio, we see that from 2025, we have a reduction or a worsening of the ratio to 2.7 Russian shells for every 1 Ukrainian shell, and to 2.3 Russian shells for every 1 Ukrainian shell in 2027, which is the same level as it is today. So this is bad news, right? But it is bad news assuming the absolute worst case scenario that the US does not decide to donate anything anymore in 2026 and 2027. And if we're a bit optimistic, which I am, we will assume that the US will actually donate something, and that those ratios will actually improve in 2026 and 2027 versus the 2025 ratio. So actually, the absolute worst case scenario is that things get a bit worse in 26 and then get back to the 25 levels. But in any slightly more optimistic scenario, things will simply get better from 2025 onwards for Ukraine. Having said that, that does not mean things get good, because the Russians still maintain a significant artillery advantage on the battlefield. And if you're interested, looking at the raw data, here is the raw data regarding from my research. We see for each year how much was donated. We see the type of munitions. So for example, 155 millimeter Romania versus 152 millimeter Romania, or Bulgaria as well, because certain countries produce both calibers. We see that the US is the absolute juggernaut in terms of artillery shell donations. But we also see that many of the countries are increasing their production significantly, right? Because if we look all the way to the estimated for 2027, we see that Germany is going to hit up to 400,000 artillery shell production. That's more than a doubling versus what they produce today. That's because they have new plants in the pipeline. You can also see the sources in the far right corner. We see that the Czech initiative is an absolute juggernaut, which is also planned to still keep pumping tons of artillery shells towards Ukraine. We see that Poland is going from 40,000 to 180,000 artillery shells. We see that the UK is really taking it seriously. They're planning 6 new shell factories, planned and or announced, with 550,000 shells per year planned by 2027. That's a huge number. Who else is big? Spain, thanks to the Rheinmetall XPAL output. So they've hit now the maximum of 450,000. We see that, for example, even the Benelux, I clustered them together, but actually it's essentially fully production from Belgium, because Belgium produces French Caesar ammunition. There's no Dutch or Luxembourgian production. We see that Hungary is going up a lot thanks to Rheinmetall production facilities. Romania is going up a lot thanks to Rheinmetall production facilities. We see that even 152 millimeter production has increased in Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, which is questionable how much of those donations will go to Ukraine. And then you can see that for US, I took the worst case scenario. We see the 1.5 million donations in 2025, and then 0 in 26 and 0 in 27. I think it's safer this way, so that we can only be positively surprised as opposed to negatively surprised. So I think it's safer to take the worst case scenario. And then we also see, obviously, Ukraine going up in production of 155 and 152. There's also a Rheinmetall factory coming online there. And the Baltics, right? The Baltics had several new announcements. Some of them aren't even hitting yet in 2027, because Rheinmetall has announced new factories in a bunch of Baltic states, but some of them, they're all under construction or planned, and some of them are only coming online in 28 or 29, but the first ones are already going to start producing in 26, 27 planned, right? So closing out with a channel update. First of all, if you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'm a small, non-monetized channel, and this takes a lot of work to do, this research, and I would really appreciate it, right? Second of all, you guys really loved my last video. I got 87 new subscribers. That's 18% growth in my channel in terms of subscribers, and I think that's really great results. With that, I've now finished the oil refinery revisiting video. I've, with this video, revisited the artillery shell video, which you guys gave me so many inputs and information about how I could improve it. And I still have potentially the artillery barrel video to revisit. So artillery barrel wasting production video that is in my pipeline. And then if you want to look at the data on my oil refinery video, 2,200 of you watched it. You watched it for 204 hours. That's more than 4 days. I think that's really excellent data. And because you guys love those videos so much, I'm also thinking about going deeper into that direction and looking at, for example, how many Russian oil terminals have been hit, or how many Russian chemical plants have been hit. So that's maybe something that you guys might be interested in me analyzing and looking at. And then finally, as you know, I'm an author, and if you have already liked and if you have already commented and subscribed and you want to support me more, do take a look at my books on Amazon. The links are in the description. And 3 of you actually bought my books after having watched my oil refinery visit video. Thank you so much for that. 2 of you watched my AI or bought my AI book, and 1 of you bought my World War II fiction book. Thank you so much for that support. It really helps. As you know, I'm not monetized. And see you in the next video. Thank you so much.